Yep, so this is the second session of the week. This is on forms. We did a previous session yesterday on the basics of HTML. So when we share the videos out, this is literally just looking at forms and form elements, but there was a session yesterday covering a whole bunch of other elements as well, so that might be useful. Forms are kind of the backbone of all digital services. So in gov.uk or DWP or HMRC, when you're applying for stuff, when you're trying to renew things, anything that's kind of a digital service, as we call it, is essentially just a well-designed web form. So they do make up the majority of what we do on the internet. There's this myth that keeps persisting, which is that users prefer less clicks. So a lot of UX designers or interaction designers or whatever you want to call them will talk about getting things done in the least number of clicks. But actually, research shows that breaking complex things down into small, manageable parts actually creates a more successful user journey. So you don't need to have one massive long form because it's got less clicks to get through it. Actually, we should be breaking things down into small, manageable chunks. And the number of clicks that it takes somebody to get through isn't as important as people think that it is, as long as the context is there. Form should be dynamic and as easy as possible to use. So if users don't have to engage with anything, if there's certain parts of the form that are not relevant, then make sure that you are smart in the way that you design the form so that they don't have to fill it out. So sometimes that might mean, you've got a collapsible section and the questions are hidden in there, or it might just be a case of you skip that page if they've answered a question a certain way. A really bad example is where we see labels which says something along the lines of only answer this question if you've answered yes to the previous one. By this point, you should know what they've answered on the previous one, and then you can dynamically change that question. So you don't end up with a lot of cognitive load of trying to remember all of the previous answers and working out if you need to fill that question or not. But today we're going to look at the basic building blocks of forms. So we're going to look at the form element, input elements, labels, legends, and form groups. The form element is the main part of a form, as you can probably imagine, but all inputs must be placed inside of a form element. This creates a landmark so that assistive technology users can find interactive elements easier. Sometimes we see people have just put radio buttons on a page for some reason. They're not in a form and they're using JavaScript to make them work. They probably will work in most cases, but it means that if you're using assistive technology, then you don't know necessarily that that's something to fill out, because something like JAWS, you can list the forms on the page, and if there's no form tags, it won't find them. So everything that is interactive in terms of buttons, inputs, that kind of thing should be in a form element. The input element is the stuff that goes inside the form tag, and this is the main way that we collect data from a user. They may type data into a field, they may select options, use buttons, but either way, you're getting user input to then navigate your way through that form. Some of the really common inputs that you're likely to see, which users type into, are dates, emails, numbers, passwords, searches, telephone numbers, and text fields. There's a whole bunch of other ones, but these are the ones that we commonly see. And then there's inputs which you might see which users select. So again, common ones are buttons, checkboxes, radio buttons, and submit. With submit and buttons are often interchangeable, which we'll look at in a second, but these are some of the common ones that you'll see. Again, there is a whole bunch of other ones which we're not going to cover because they're a little bit more rare, I guess. But yeah, these are the common ones you're likely to see. Every input that you have on the page is defined by a type, and the type is normally used for three things. So one is to activate HTML5 validation, two is to set the context for screen readers, and three is to show the correct virtual keyboard when you're using a device like a mobile phone. But we don't recommend using HTML validation because it's not robust. It can get confusing. And if you turn it off, it means you can implement your own accessible validation patterns using good content and interaction design. So if you add a type to a field, then it's going to try and validate that in a certain way. So if you use type equals email, the browser's then going to try and work out if you've put an email address in that field. but the HTML5 default validation is a bit rubbish. And I've kind of got a bit of an example of that. And I'll show you why the HTML5 validation is not really fit for purpose. So we've got a few fields here. We've got an email address field, which has a type of email. We've got a website address field, which has a type of URL. And we've got a phone number field, which has a type of tel. And what you'll see is when I try and submit this form, VoiceOver is going to try and read out the validation messages.
A validation demo, HTML, forms. Enter an email address.
So it's told us to enter an email address, which is fair enough. I've only wrote my name in here, so it's saying enter an email address. Yeah, okay, fair. That one worked. So if I type in here,
Gmail. Gmail.
So now I've wrote Craig Abbott at Gmail. It's still not a valid email address. It doesn't have .com on the end, which it should do, but I've filled it out a little bit further. Now when I submit it, the browser is going to think this is fine, and it's going to move on to validating this field. So if I do that,
enter a URL. You are currently on a text element.
So as you can see, it doesn't think there's an error in this email address field anymore, even though there is. It isn't a valid email address, but the browser now thinks it is. So this would cause the user to submit invalid information, which we couldn't use. We couldn't email them back. We don't know if it works. The second problem now is that it's asking me to put a URL in, and I've wrote craigabbott.co.uk, which technically is a URL, but it doesn't have all of the slashes and all of the colons and all of the things that it needs in it. So I might try and fix this by going a step further and putting www in.
Craig Abbott Co.uk, W misspelled, www.craigabbott.co.uk.
So now I've wrote a full web address and I'm going to try and submit it again.
Enter a URL.
And it's still not happy with it. And actually what it's looking for is the whole thing.
www.https:// You are currently on a text field.
So now it's happy with that. And then I'll show you that it doesn't actually validate phone numbers at all. So if I write a word in here.
Phone number, edit text, telephone number field, UMER, number.
And then it doesn't throw any validation errors at all. So this is why HTML5 validation is not really reliable. We've got an invalid email address. We've had to really try hard to get the website address in there. And then we've wrote number in the phone number and it thinks that that's fine. So this is why we shouldn't really use HTML5 validation. So if we remove the fact that it does HTML5 validation, the type of the input can also add context for screen reader users. So for example, if the screen reader reads out input type equals email, then it's probably quite clear that you are expected to put an email address in that field. But the context isn't always consistent. So for example, if you use type equals number in Safari, it will call that an incremental edit text number field. In Chrome and Firefox, it'll call it a stepper. And in Firefox, there's also a bug where if you use a number field, it'll actually read out none when the field is empty, which I'll show you in a second, but it's not ideal. In fact, there's a whole bunch of issues with the number field. So Chrome will silently discard non-numeric input, which I have just showed you on the telephone number field, but it does the same thing on number. So if you just write in text into the number field, then it doesn't throw any validation errors at all. The user can accidentally change the numbers using the arrow keys without realizing. So if you're using a screen reader, a lot of moving around the page is done with the arrow keys. So you might press up or down to move through paragraphs. And if you've left the focus on the number field, when you press up and down, it'll change the number. So if you imagine if you've got something like an account number, you've wrote your 8-digit account number into the field, and then you press down, it's going to change the last digit from, if you put a 7, it'll change to a 6. So you can accidentally enter the wrong information because you've not realized that it's changed. And that's because the number field has these little arrows that get controlled with the arrow key. So it can create more errors than just using a different field. Users can also accidentally change the numbers using the scroll wheel on the mouse or the scroll gesture on a trackpad. So if you're using a mouse and you've left the mouse pointer over that field and you go to scroll the page, it'll change the number in the box, which is also a bit dangerous. If you use NVDA, which is a screen reader, numbers don't appear in the element list for some reason. I think that's a bug with NVDA, but it happens. And also, if you're using Dragon and you're trying to dictate into a number field, they don't always work. We had a lot of issues with gov.uk components, which used the date field was made up of number fields and you couldn't dictate into them. So they had to change that. So there's a lot of issues with the number field. So it isn't as straightforward as you might think. Dates can also be problematic. You can use a date input and that'll give you a nice field with slashes in where you can add a date in and it kind of formats it. It'll give you a little date picker as well, which you can use with the mouse, but they're also quite problematic. So VoiceOver ignores the label on date inputs. If you assign a label to it and then you go into the date field, it won't read the label out. It also can read dates as percentages, which I'll show you in a minute. When it's in Chrome and Firefox, it'll read the dates out as percentages, which is just weird. It works okay in Safari, but it doesn't work so much in Chrome and Firefox. In Chrome and Firefox, they have date pickers as well, which has a little icon to activate it. These work with a mouse, but they don't always work with a keyboard. And Firefox has a weird bug which jams VoiceOver when you're using it with a mouse. So if you're using VoiceOver because you have dyslexia and you prefer things to be read out, you can't use the date picker when VoiceOver is turned on because it'll just jam it up, which I'll show you in a second. And Safari also has a bug which doesn't complete the full date when using VoiceOver. I'm going to show you these. So these are the different inputs. I'm going to turn VoiceOver on and then we're going to go through them. So the first one is just a type of text.
First name, edit text, main.
Pretty straightforward. The second one is a number field, and you can see that by these little arrows here.
Age, incrementable edit text number field.
So it reads that out as an incrementable edit text number field. If I go into Chrome and go onto the same field.
Chrome. First name, age, stepper.
So now it's a stepper, and it's the same in Firefox.
Firefox. Age, stepper. You are currently on a stepper.
So we've got a stepper here, and I don't know if you noticed it said NaN beforehand. I'll just do that again.
Phone number, NaN. Age, stepper.
So it's reading out NaN before it reads anything out. And the reason why it does this is because it's trying to validate a number. And if you put text in, it'll throw an error in JavaScript or whatever, which is not a number. And that's what NaN stands for. The problem is it's firing before you've even wrote anything in there. So it's treating a blank field as not a number, and then it's reading it out on the screen reader. So it can be a little bit confusing as to why it's saying NaN before everything. So if we go back into
Safari.
The next field is a telephone number field.
Phone number, edit text telephone number field.
Again, pretty straightforward. And then we've got the date field, and you'll notice it won't read the label.
09. Group. You are currently on a text element.
So it just read 09 group, doesn't read out date of birth. It ignores the label, which is a bit problematic. We also have this problem with Safari, where if I have voice control turned off.
Application. VoiceOver off.
If I have voice control turned off and I use the date picker, say I choose the 3rd of September, then we can see that the 3rd of September has been populated into the field, and that's fine. If I try and do it when VoiceOver is turned on, you'll see it only actually puts part of the date in.
VoiceOver on Safari. Phone number, edit text 2022. Continue. You are currently on a button.
So when I've tried to use the date picker this time, only the years worked. And for some reason, voice control causes the date input not to work. So that's another reason as to why it's a bit broke. If we go into Chrome, we have this little icon here for the date picker, but you can't get to that with a keyboard, which is annoying because you can see it, but you can't get to it. So unless you're using a mouse, that's not going to work. And again, in Firefox, you have a date picker, but you can't see it. If you click into the field with a mouse, it'll just appear, but you can't get to it with a keyboard. And I'll show you the VoiceOver issue where it locks up if you're using a mouse and the two of them together.
VoiceOver on Firefox, none.
So if I'm using VoiceOver again, if it's something like dyslexia and you wanted to read it out and you're using a mouse along with VoiceOver, when you click in the field, you maybe get like a second of the date picker popping up and then it takes it away again, but it still continues to read it out.
Button, dimmed button.
So if I click on it again.
Button, dimmed button. You are currently on a toolbar item palette.
So it's telling me I'm on a toolbar item palette, but I can't see it. So it's took the keyboard focus in and then it's just hidden the field. So there's a bit of a bug with that as well. So hopefully them demos kind of highlighted some of the pitfalls to do with the different input types. So to look at how you can kind of get around those things, research does actually show that text inputs can be made to work for most things, but you do need to do a little bit of work. So you need to have a clear label. You need to provide additional attributes so browsers know which virtual keyboard to show, and you kind of need to make sure that you test everything. So in terms of making sure the right keyboards show up, there is an attribute called input mode, and that can tell the browser, I want you to use this certain keyboard. It's really important for mobile devices. We've probably all been on websites where you're trying to input something like an email address and it keeps adding spaces and the @ symbol isn't there on the keyboard and you've got to kind of go looking for it. And that's because they've used the wrong type or they've used the wrong input mode. So for example, if we just wanted to use, instead of using a stepper or an incremental number field, if we make that just a text input and then we set the input mode to number, that means that it'll then take the number input. But when you go onto a mobile device and you click on that field, it's just going to give you the keypad that has the numbers on it. It's not going to give you letters because it knows you can't use them. Few examples of virtual keyboards. So the generic keyboard for text, it's a QWERTY keyboard and it has predictive text normally on the top bar as well. So it'll try and make suggestions for things it wants you to type in. If you add the input mode as email, it'll give you the @ symbol and the full stop at the bottom so you can very quickly write in your email address. It'll also turn off suggestive text, so it won't try and add spaces, it won't try and capitalize things, it'll just keep it fairly straightforward. And then if you put in something like input mode equals tel, it'll give you a telephone keypad, so it'll give you the plus, star, and hash symbols in case you need those. It'll give you the numbers. There's a whole bunch of different ones as well. It's worth looking them up. You can do things like input mode equals decimal and it'll give you all of the numbers plus a full stop. You can do input mode equals URL and it'll give you slashes and things like that. So we just said there the text type kind of works better for those things. In terms of using them for numbers, again, once you've added that input type as numeric, you might also want to add something like spell check equals false. It'll stop the device trying to spell check whatever you put in there. It probably won't matter because you're just putting numbers in there, but just in case, it's normally worth just sort of overriding the spell check attribute if you're going to be using a text field for anything which isn't text. But there are a lot more advanced examples than the ones that I'm going to be showing in here. If you go into the gov.uk design system and just look at the text components, you can see the HTML there. You can kind of work out what they're doing. They've done a whole bunch of research behind the scenes to work out what's the best way to kind of display these things. The text type is also better for dates. So again, another good example can be found in the gov.uk design system, but breaking the date down into 3 individual fields for day, month, and year means that the label does work. And it also means that you don't end up with them weird voiceover bugs that we saw before where the date picker is kind of hijacked on what you're trying to do. And nobody really has issues with these in gov.uk services. Very rarely we see people not being able to get past the date pattern, if you like. So I guess the question boils down to is, should you use the input type or should you use input mode? And as a general rule of thumb, I'd advise not using type number or type equals date. But other than that, if you can use the type and the context is correct, then use the type. So if you've got an email address field, then by all means use type equals email. And for the most part, that will work. But remember to turn off the HTML5 validation and handle that on your own. For anything else, just use type equals text and assign a suitable input mode to make sure that the right virtual keyboard shows up. And I guess the fourth and most important point is just test it thoroughly. Just test it and test it and test it until you're sure that the right keyboards are showing up. It works with screen readers and there isn't any weird bugs happening because there's so many bugs that happen with these input modes. And I think what's happened is browsers have implemented a lot of additional types over the years to try and make things easier to use, but they haven't necessarily collaborated with people who are building assistive technology and those kind of things. And the way that they get handled isn't consistent. So definitely test it. If you're using inputs where people type into them and whatnot, then you need to make sure that the browser can kind of identify what the purpose of each input is. And this is important if you want to pass WCAG criteria on 1.3.5, identify input purpose. Sometimes it isn't exactly clear what identify input purpose is relating to, but it's mainly around the use of the autocomplete attribute. So we've probably all been on websites before where you go to checkout, you go to buy something, you get to the checkout, and you go to type your address in, and Google Chrome just goes, do you want us to put your address in? And you click it and it autofills everything. When you're using inputs, you need to make sure that you kind of marry the fields up to those autocomplete values. If you use the right autocomplete value, then the user can very quickly just fill in stuff. They fill in all the time, their name, their address, their date of birth. You know, there's things that are just constantly on every single website that they can fill in, and that makes it a lot easier. You know, you can maybe fill your address in one click instead of like typing it out into 10 fields or whatever. The way we do that is with the autocomplete attribute. So for example, you might put autocomplete equals name. And if another field on another website is also using autocomplete equals name, if the browser's filled it in before, we'll then make suggestions about what you might want to put in that field. There is a full list of autocomplete values, so you've got to kind of go through them and match them against your design. So once you've got your design and you know what your form's going to look like, go through all of the different fields and match them up with the autocomplete value. So you might have a name, or you might have first name and last name, in which case you'll need given name and family name. You might have an email address, you'll need email. Postal code could be postcode. You might have address line 1, address line 2. There's a whole list of them. If you go on MDN and look up the autocomplete value, it'll tell you all of the different fields you can have. And if you match them up, it means that when people come to fill it in, it'll be a lot easier. The caveat to that is that autocomplete should only be used when users fill in their own data. So if you're entering other people's information, then you want to make sure that you disable autocomplete, as some browsers will still try to be helpful if it thinks it recognizes a field. So even if you've not specified an autocomplete value, if you haven't set it to off and the browser thinks that it knows what that field is, it might still make suggestions. And the problem you'll have with that is if you're making something like a staff-facing service and they're processing benefits and they are putting in dozens of people's names into them fields every day, it might start to try and autofill the previous claimants' details into them fields, which means you might end up paying the wrong person the benefits, or you might get their information wrong or something along those lines. So for things like staff-facing services where you're constantly putting in other people's information, then you should turn autocomplete off, and you should try and name the input something that the browser's not going to recognize. For anything where it's the user filling in their own information, then definitely turn it on. This brings us on to labels. So every input needs a text label. That's kind of the beginning and the end of it, I guess. But the label should let the user know what they actually need to use that field for. And labels are covered by 4 different WCAG criteria. They're covered by 1.3.1 informed relationships. They're covered by 2.4.6 headings and labels. They're covered by 3.3.2 labels or instructions, and 2.5.3 label and name. So I don't know. This is one of the things that annoys me, I guess, about WCAG is it's split up and it's so fragmented that it can be difficult to know exactly what you need to do for a label. But in a nutshell, you need to just make sure every input has got a label. You need to make sure that the label is clear, that it makes sense. It must be obvious which input the label is related to. So that's both visually and if you're using something like a screen reader. The label that's visible on the page must also be part of the accessible label. And we'll touch on that again in a minute. But sometimes you've got a different label for a screen reader than you do that's visible on the page. If that's the case, it just needs to kind of match, but it doesn't have to be exact. And finally, it must be obvious if a field is required or optional. So there are 2 ways that we can assign labels to an input. You can also use ARIA. There's a 3rd way to do it. You could use an ARIA label, but that does tend to overcomplicate things. And it means when you're looking through your code, sometimes you might miss the fact that an input actually has a label. It's much better to use the label tag. So the first way you can do it is using the for and ID attributes. So you give the input an ID, and then you use the for attribute on the label and tie the 2 together. So in this example, we've got label for last hyphen name, and then the input has an ID of last hyphen name, and that's how the browser knows them to go together. Another way you can do it is you can have an implicit label where you nest the input inside of the label tag. So in this case, the input is just a type of text that's inside of that label tag. So it automatically assigns last name to that label. You can do it either way. Personally, I prefer to use for an ID because I think it just makes it more obvious when I'm looking through the code which ones go together, but you can do it. Both ways are fine. We often see an accessibility issue called an orphaned input. It's a really common accessibility issue, and it's where an input looks like it's got a label when you look at it visually, but they're not actually assigned to one another. So in this example, we've got a label and we've got an input, but we're not using for an ID, and we haven't tied them together by nesting the input and the label. So on the screen, it looks fine, but when you try and hit it with a screen reader, it isn't going to be connected. And I'll just very quickly show you an orphaned input. So I think in this example, the input for last name is orphaned. So first name and the input are tied together. Last name and this input aren't tied together, but they look identical. And it's not until you try and use them that you'll see the problem.
Voiceover on Safari. First name, edit text, main. Blank, main.
So yeah, basically this one said first name, edit text. So far, so good. This one just said edit text blank because it doesn't realize that that label is actually attached to it. So before we mentioned the label in name, where we said you can have different labels for visual and non-visual users. And what this means is that whatever is visible on the screen must be in the accessible name too. So you've got an example here where we have a search input field and there's a label on it which says search. We've then used an ARIA label to change the label for the input. So although the label search is visible on the page, when you hit it with a screen reader, it'll actually read out search for people, pages, or blog posts. That is fine because the ARIA label contains the word search and the word search is visible on the page. So you can make the distinction. In the example at the bottom, that one is a bad example. We've overridden the ARIA label and said find people, pages, or blog posts, but the word search is on the page, therefore there's a mismatch. So again, if you're looking at the page visually and you're also using a screen reader, then there's going to be a mismatch. And it also means if you're using something like Dragon and you try and say click search, it's not going to find it because Dragon will be looking for, if you say click find, it will, but if you say click search, it's not going to. And I'll just very quickly demo that as well.
Voiceover on Safari. Search for people, pages or blog posts. Search text field, main. Find people, pages or blog posts. Search text field.
So yeah, just a quick example. It says search on the page, but when you actually hit it with a screen reader, it's saying find people. And because the two words are different, that doesn't count. But as long as the visible word is inside the label and the screen reader does read it out at some point, then that's fine. So examples where we sometimes see this on gov.uk services are on check your answers pages where you might just have a bunch of links down the side that say change, but actually when you hit it with a screen reader, it'll say something like change address, change name, change age or whatever. As long as the word's in there and they're similar, that's fine. The field set element is the next thing we're going to look at. So this is a way to group related inputs and it provides additional context. So you should always use a legend with a field set. So an example might be like having an address. So you've got a group of inputs which are related. You might have address line 1, address line 2, town or city, and postcode. If you don't put these in a field set, they just look like a bunch of inputs on a page. But if you put them in a field set and you put a legend at the top, it then provides additional context for assistive technology. So again, there's a demo. So here we've got exactly the code that you've just seen. We've got an address with line 1, line 2, town or city, and postcode. And these are all nested inside of a field set. And there's a label at the top which just says address. And what we'll hopefully find when we hit it with a screen reader is it'll give that additional context from the legend.
Line 1, edit text, address. Line 2, edit text, address. Town or city, edit text, address. Postcode, edit text, address.
So yeah, When you group things together using a legend, the legend can also be read out by the screen reader. It almost gets attached to every label in that field set. And that means that if you've got a long group of questions, the user doesn't have to try and remember what they're related to if they can't see the page. And it also means they don't have to kind of navigate all the way back up to listen to the heading and then go all the way back down again. It's very obvious that every single one of them fields was part of the address. Required fields is a really interesting one. I've just seen a question pop up saying, do you need to have the legend visible? You don't need to have the legend visible as long as it's sort of obvious in another way. So a lot of the time on gov.uk services, we do have the legend visible. We will say things like, what is your address would be the legend, and then the labels are attached to those underneath. You can hide the legend. You can kind of, in most cases, you can hide anything as long as it's still there for screen readers. But the thing that you've got to be careful of is if you hide it, it still has to be obvious that they're related. So if you had them under a heading that was something like, what is your address? And then you hid the legend to stop it repeating. If the fields were closer together or something of that nature, then you might not need to have it visible. But it just depends on context. As long as it's obvious that they're related when you look at it visually and when you hit it with a screen reader, then you can hide it if you want. But if you hide it and it then is no longer clear that they're related, then it would probably fail. So we're going to look at required fields next. These can be quite interesting because there seems to be a standard way that people do it on the internet, which is to just add an asterisk to everything. So we'll often see things like surname asterisk, and the little asterisk means that it's required. If you do use an asterisk, you must explain what it means before people use the form. That'll probably do enough to pass WCAG 2.1, but it will still be awful for the user. So if you don't tell the user what the asterisk means, if you literally just have a form, there's little stars all over it, and you don't explain what the star means, it's going to be a definite fail. If you write at the very top of the form that the required fields are marked with the asterisk, then it'll probably pass technically, but it will still be a bit of a rubbish user experience, which I'll show you now. So I've got another example where we've just got required fields are marked with an asterisk or a asterisk symbol, and then each field has it on. And what you'll see is if you're using a screen reader, it very quickly becomes annoying.
Heading level 1. Marking required fields with required fields are marked with an asterisk or star symbol. You are currently on a text element.
So immediately, although it's an asterisk symbol, you'll see that the screen reader read it out as a star symbol.
First name star, edit text. Last name star, edit text.
And it means every time you go into a field, it's going to read out star at the end, which it's fine if you've got it on one or two fields, but as you can imagine, if you've got that all the way through a digital service, every single field just saying star after it, it'll very quickly get annoying. And I guess the question that you've got to ask yourself is, if we're doing true user-centered design, do we even need to have fields marked as being required? Because if we don't need it, why are we asking for it? So we should just assume that if we're asking for it, then it is required. And that means that you can then mark optional ones instead. So if you've got everything in the form as being required, you don't need to tell somebody that every field is required because that's just the assumption. For anything which you definitely think is optional, the first question is, do we really need to ask for it? And if you do decide that you want to ask for it, then just put optional in it, in which case the screen reader will just read out email optional, and you don't have to faff on using stars and things, asterisks or whatever. When it comes to submitting a form, it needs to be very deliberate. And this is covered by two WCAG criteria, which are 3.2.1 on focus and 3.2.2 on input. This basically means that it needs to be a button or something of that nature where it is a very deliberate action by the user and they can't accidentally submit the form by doing the wrong interaction. For on focus, it simply means that tabbing to an element with the keyboard doesn't submit the form. I have never seen this happen to date, to be honest. So unless you're doing something weird, it's probably not something you need to worry about. But to test it, it's basically just a case of tab through the whole form and make sure that it doesn't fire. Like I say, I've never seen it happen. I don't know why you would want to make it fire on focus, but it's in there just to make sure that nobody does anything silly. On input, you are more likely to see this one. This one is more common. It means you can't submit a form by selecting something other than a deliberate action. For example, you can't submit a form by selecting a radio button. I say you can't. If you've told the user beforehand and that's the expected experience, then you technically can, but you can't just not tell them that's going to happen and then make it happen. So, for example, you might have a quiz or an exam where you've got different answers, and when you click an answer, that then accepts it as the answer. If you told the user that's how it was going to happen, then it might be okay. But for the most part, you would have them able to choose the radio button they want and then click continue or click submit or whatever to make sure that that is a final thing that they want to do. Another thing that you sometimes see is where people have toggles. So they might use radio buttons for something like a toggle switch. And when you click the radio, it refreshes the page and activates a toggle. Again, if you're using form elements like inputs, then you can't just have them fire a form when you're toggling them unless the user's been warned beforehand. So everything's about context. Personally, I would always try and avoid interactions like this where you have to explain the user interface, because that normally means that you're using the wrong elements or maybe there's a better way of doing something. Buttons versus input type of submit comes up quite a bit. So there's two ways you can submit a form. You can either use input, give it a type of submit and a value, which will then make it appear like a button, or you can use an actual button element. I always use a button element. It's more flexible because button is a block. You can add other things to it. So you might decide that you want an icon or something on the button, and you can do that a lot easier if you're using a button element. Whereas with an input, you can just add a string as a value. You can't really tack things on unless you're adding CSS classes and things. So either one's fine. They both work interchangeably in terms of submit the form, but which one you use probably just depends on your preference and what it is that you're trying to do. And finally, we're going to come on to errors, and these are covered by 3 of the WCAG criteria. So there's 3.3.1 error identification, 3.3.3 error suggestion, and 3.3.4 error prevention, which is for legal or financial or data. For error identification, again, this is one of the areas where WCAG splits it up, and then it can be difficult to understand what it's getting at. Error identification basically just says you must highlight any field and name the field which caused the error. But this criterion in particular doesn't care if you tell the user why it's broken. So for example, you could just have an error message which says there's an error with the date your passport was issued. So you're telling the user there's an error with that field, but you're not telling them what the error is. And that's enough to pass error identification. But then we've got error suggestion, which is another WCAG criterion. And this is actually, you've got to tell them what's wrong with it. And the reason they're split up is because of the different levels of WCAG. So if you're just going for level A compliance, then telling them that there's a problem with that field is enough. But if you're going for level AA compliance, you also need to include error suggestion. So if you tell the user why it's failed, then you also pass the previous one. But because they're split into different levels, it can sometimes be confusing as to why they're so fragmented. But in our case, because we have to hit AA, we've got to do both. And in this case, saying something along the lines of the date your passport was issued must be in the past. This way, you're telling them that the date that they've entered for when their passport was issued, there's an error with it, but you're also telling them what the error is. And you're saying you put a date in that must be in the future. It's got to be in the past. So it's more obvious now what's wrong with it. And then error prevention is looking to make sure that the user that they can go back and review stuff and they can change any of the inputs that they've used. You can technically, if you've just got a work and back button and you're using good session management, that is acceptable. You know, if you get to the end of a form and right before you click submit, you go, I want to go back and look at all my answers, and you click the back button in the browser, if every page you go to, it puts the answers back in and selects the buttons that you previously selected, then you can review everything that way. And then you can just go forward again and submit the form at the end. That's totally fine. It is a little bit laborious for the user, but that is acceptable. The cleanest way you can kind of hit this this sort of WCAG criteria is just to use the GovUK check your answers pattern, where right before you submit a form, you play back everything that they've entered and give them an opportunity to review it and then change it from there. That's a much cleaner way of doing it, but just having a working back button is fine. You don't need a check your answers page to make sure that you pass the criteria on. You just need to have a way of actually doing it. And I think one of the biggest issues that we see with errors is that people just don't know that they've happened. So there are some other things that you can do to make it easier. So the easiest thing, well, yeah, one of the easiest things you can do is just to actually append error to the page title. So the page title is what you see in the browser tab. So up here, we've got required fields demo HTML forms. We've got error, your details, error example HTML forms. These are the page titles. And this is the one that I'm going to show you in a second, but you can see it says error in front of it. So it's obvious that there's an error on this page now. It's very easy to do that, and it should be done just because screen readers will often read the page title out before you engage with the page. So it just makes it really obvious there's an error just before the user even goes any further. You can then use an error summary. So you put an error summary at the top of the page. And this means if somebody's made a mistake, one, they can easily see that there's an error, but it also means that if somebody's using a screen reader, they very quickly get a summary of what the errors are on the page. So if you put this just inside of your main tag above the H1, that means that before they even get to the main content of the page, they're going to be able to read that error. They're going to know there was a problem. They're going to know that the date the passport was issued must be in the past, and they're going to know that they need to enter a postcode in the correct format. And then you link to the field from the error summary. This also makes it easier. So if you've told the user what the error is at the top of the page, you can then just add the links in the top, which just connect to the ID on the input. So you can very quickly just go, oh, I need to enter my first name, click on that error, it'll jump you down to the input and you can enter it. And there's a little demo of that as well. So this is a really simple version of the stuff that you get on gov.uk. Again, if you're building gov.uk services, use the error summary component, use the error messages component, but this is a really sort of simple version of what they're trying to achieve. So we've got an error summary, we've got a big heading at the top that says there's a problem, we've got a link to the form field which caused the error, and it tells you what you need to do. And if we hit this with a screen reader, hopefully you'll see why these things are important.
Error, your details. Error example, HTML, forms.
So straight away, it's read out the page title. It said error, your details, error example. And now we're going to try and navigate down the rest of the page.
Error, your details. Error example, HTML, forms. Web content has keyboard focus. Heading level 2, there's a problem. List one item. You are currently in a list.
So it's told us there's a problem. Then it said, here's a list of the problems. And then we go into that and we get what the first problem is.
Bullet. Visited link. Enter your first name. You are currently on a link. To click this link, press Ctrl Option Space.
So it said enter your first name. And if I click that link, it's going to jump me straight down to the input which actually caused the problem.
First name, edit text, main.
And then I can very quickly just put my name in.
First name edit Joe. Name.
And then I could continue and that will be it done. In this example, I guess there's only 2 fields, so it looks probably like overkill. But if you can imagine, if you've got multiple fields on a page, it can very quickly get a bit unwieldy and it's hard to figure out exactly what it is that you need to fix. And that's the last demo. And that is the end of this session. So I know that it's been a lot. It's a lot to cram into an hour session. I know I haven't covered other form elements like radio buttons or checkboxes. But if that's something that you want to see in the future, please do let us know. We can always structure some more sessions around those kind of topics. And that is everything. So thanks very much for patiently listening to that.
Thank you very much, Craig. That was really, really good. I learned a lot from that.
Courtney? Yeah, thanks so much, Craig, for going through that. I did have a question on error summaries. You mentioned in the example there are obviously 2 inputs on the page. I know the Gov design system sort of recommends 1 thing per page, so I was just curious, if you've got 1 question on the page, is an error summary still necessary?
Not always. It can be overkill if you just have 1 thing on the, if there's only 1 field on the page and you've told them there's an error, my personal take on that is it's probably overkill to have a full error summary with a list with a link in it. But it just depends on how it tests in research, I guess. If people are struggling to find the error, maybe it needs a summary. Under the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, the summary isn't something that you need to have. It's just a way that GDS have found of making it really simple. So if you only have one thing on the page, it's probably not always necessary, but I would refer everything back to user research and just see if, if you don't have it in there, is it causing problems? I guess the other thing to mention is that you're absolutely right. One thing per page is the preferred approach. But for things like internal services, what I probably should have mentioned is we found that one thing per page is very frustrating for staff members who are perhaps what you would call like power users of an application. They use it every day. They just want to get their job done. And we did find that one thing per page, particularly on slow government networks, can be quite frustrating. So on internal services, we found that grouping one theme per page tend to work better. So if you've got something like your details and then you've got all of your name, your last name, your date of birth, all the things that are related to that theme on one page, and then on the next page you have all the things related to the next theme, that tended to work better for internal services, in which case that error summary then became a lot more useful because there was way more things on the page that you could get wrong. But yeah, it's a good question, and I think it's just going to have to be how it tests. I would say it's probably overkill in most cases, but if people are struggling with it, then it might be worth putting it in.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks so much.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon, and a huge thank you to Craig for all the effort he's put into putting that together and for explaining it so clearly.